Now remember, we said we were going to have two data models in this lesson and not just one. So let's create that second data model, which we're going to call microposts because they're short posts. Let's review what the micropost model looks like. Here it is. Microposts have an ID, which is an integer, a content string, and then it has a foreign key corresponding to the user that created that micropost. So let's take a look at this. Remember what we did before. We're going to do the same thing, except instead of user, we're going to say micropost. So Rails generate scaffold micropost, and then I'm going to say content colon string. Remember, the ID gets created automatically. We don't have to do that explicitly. And then user underscore ID colon integer. So notice that it's broken across the line here. It's gone past the width of the terminal window. It doesn't really do any harm to keep typing it, but in this case I'm going to show how to extend it across a line with a backslash. The book uses this convention, and now you know why. If you've noticed that in the book, this is why. So here we go. User ID colon integer, and this should complete our data model here. Now, if you've got some experience using version control, at this point, you might be a little concerned because you'll notice that we actually made an edit to the user's controller. We actually changed the index action by deleting some stuff that we didn't need. The stuff that we deleted, actually, it does do something, but we didn't need it for the purposes of our demonstration. In any case, when you're using version control, it's a really good idea to commit a change like that before generating all of this stuff. And so I want to show you how to undo what we just did. Notice all these things got created. It's just a mess. In fact, oftentimes what you'll do is you'll even migrate the database and change the database and update it with a new data model, only to realize that you want to undo things and maybe make a commit or do something else. In this case, we want to commit the change we made to the user's controller. And so this is a really useful thing to know how to do, which is to undo these things. Here we go. So the first thing is to undo that migration. I'm going to do rake db rollback. So that reverted the database migration. And now I'm going to get rid of that scaffold. And you could try to delete all those files by hand, but it's just such a nightmare. And I guarantee that as you do Rails development, you are going to want to do things like this where you reverse stuff. It's such a mess if you have to do it by hand. But luckily, you can do Rails, instead of Rails generate, you can do Rails destroy scaffold and then microposts. Now you can generation works with lots of things. You can generate a model or a controller. This is the general inversion. So Rails generate something, and then the name of the thing can be undone by Rails destroy what the thing is. So Rails destroy controller and the name of the controller. In this case, Rails destroy scaffold micropost. You don't have to put the data model at the command line. It'll just destroy whatever is there. Okay, so we've undone everything. Let's do git status just to verify. Good. The only thing that has changed is that app controller's user's controller. So we can actually take a look at what the change was in case you forgot what it is. You can do git diff, and let's take a look at it here. So this is the diff. It just says that the minus signs there say that we just removed this stuff. I actually like to pipe git diff to TextMate because it gets nice syntax highlighting. So you can see at a glance that what this diff consists of is just removing these files here, or these lines. So let's close this down. And so I'm going to commit that change. Git commit -am. Let's say we're committing all the changes with the message simplified. The user's controller. Controllers are plural. Good. So now that we've made our commit, we're ready to generate that scaffold again. Let's just type. I'm just going to be lazy, and this is a nice trick. Control R. We'll do a reverse search, and I'm going to type micropost. So that's the destroy, and I'm going to do Control R again, and there's my Rails generate scaffold micropost. It's a nice little trick. Good. So now we've got our scaffold, and I'm going to migrate the database. Rake db migrate. And now let's see what our status is. Okay, so we've got another modification to the routes. We've got a modification to the schema, which is not surprising since we just migrated the database. The schema defines the data model. And then we have all these files here, so let's add them. I actually don't need the -a there, but my fingers want to type it, so I'm going to give in to my fingers. In this case, git commit -am added a microposts resource. Let's take a look at what that bought us. Now you might be able to guess the URL, see if you can guess it. The URL for all the users is /users. For all the microposts is /microposts. And as expected, there aren't any microposts right now, so let's create one. Create a new one. I'm going to say lorem ipsum dolor sit-amet. And let's say this is user 1. So lorem ipsum text is actually a fragment from Cicero. It's a Latin fragment from Cicero, and it's been used as dummy text for a long time. It used to be thought that it was hundreds of years, and I looked up the reference recently, and now people aren't so sure. But in any case, it's been used as dummy text for quite a while. In fact, it's become so common that in TextMate, if you type lorem and then tab, this is a tab trigger, it actually gives you a bunch of lorem ipsum text. So I'm going to use some more to create a couple more microposts. Let's make it short. Let's have this user 1. Now notice what's going on here. Notice these URLs. /microposts. New microposts is /microposts/new. Click create micropost to see if you can guess what that might be doing under the hood. Okay, it's issuing a post request to /microposts, and then it renders the show page /micropost/3. If we want to edit this, we can go to /micropost/3/edit. In this case, I'll just leave it the same. Doesn't do any harm to update it though. And so what we're seeing here is that there's a consistent structure for a resource in a Rails application. And as you might guess, if you go back to the MVC diagram, if you hit /microposts, it's being routed to the micropost controller index. So let's take a look at that. So first of all, let's take a look at the routes file. Oh wow! Just by habit, I used the Command T way of navigating in TextMate. This is the way I usually navigate files. But just to remind you, this is in it's in the Rails root config routes. It's right here. And notice what happened. Look at that. There's resources microposts in addition to resources users. So this line was automatically included by the Rails generate scaffold command. And just as resources users set up a whole bunch of URLs, so does resources micropost. So let's take a look at those. Just as a reminder, here are the routes for users. Here are the routes for microposts. Look at that. They're pretty much exactly the same. Let's put them in a line here. Look at that. Get/users goes to the index action. Get/micropost goes to the index action. It's just a different controller. So all of the actions are the same. All of the HTTP requests are the same. And the only difference in the URLs is the name of the resource, which in this case it's the plural version of the resource. So microposts or users. And so if you look inside app controllers micropost controller, you can see that there's all of this stuff. In fact, let's let's do the same modification here. Let's get rid of that stuff in the micropost controller, and then take a look at the user's controller. Look at this. You can see that they're almost exactly the same. The structure is the same. All that changes is one of them has users and the other has microposts. And notice that the scaffolding actually creates some comments that correspond to the HTTP request and the URL. So they actually have the table in here: get/micropost/new, get/micropost/1/edit. That's just comment characters that indicate what I've indicated in this table. So we see that the structure of the micropost is the same as the structure of the users. And this is a common theme in Rails applications. Now at this point, we've been calling these things microposts. But what's micro about these microposts? Well, micro implies that they're short. But right now, we have absolutely no enforcement of that. If you go to new micropost and create a micropost with lots of text, it will go all the way to the full length of a string. So in this section, we're going to talk about how to enforce a constraint on the data going into the model. So even my use of language there was a hint that we're going to look at the micropost model. See if you can guess what it will look like. Let's look at the user model just as a reminder. So remember, all this does is inherit from Active Record Base, and it gets a bunch of functionality for free because of inheritance. The micropost model is exactly the same, except micropost instead of user. Now, in order to actually enforce a constraint, though, we're going to add something to this file. We're going to use what's called a validation, and this uses the validates function, and the argument here is just the name of the attribute that we want to validate. Let me get rid of the gutter here so we can see the let's move this over. So we want to validate the content. So micropost validates content. So this thing here is what's called a Ruby symbol, and we'll be covering this in a couple lessons from now. And we want to validate the content. And in particular, we want to validate that the length is shorter than some maximum. So for now, I just want you to take on faith this syntax because we'll be covering it later, and this is, remember, just an overview. So I'm going to say that it's going to validate, it validates the content, and it's going to say the length is a maximum of, well, how long should it be? Let's use the Twitter maximum, which is 140 characters. Now let's see what happens if we try to make a micropost that is longer than 140 characters. Let's take a look at this. Of course, this is not the only validation that you would want to make in general. You would want to make sure the content isn't blank. You would want to make sure that it actually has a user, for example. But this is a useful first validation. So let's take a look at this. Let's just copy all this Lorem Ipsum text. It's certainly longer than 140 characters, and see what happens. What we would like is for somehow the application to know that this is too long, and we'd like it to enforce this limit. So let's see what happens. Look at that. So somehow the constraint that we've just implemented in the model has propagated all the way up to the view layer and has given us a nice error message saying the content is too long, maximum is 140 characters. So at this point, our microposts are honest microposts. They actually can't be longer than 140 characters. The second thing I want to show you at this point is the way that Rails stitches together data models. Remember, we talked about this idea of a foreign key in the micropost model. So let's take a look at how that works. Here's a diagram of the association between microposts and users. So the micropost table has these three columns. It has the ID. Remember, we talked about the micropost model here. It has an ID, it has a content, and it has the user ID foreign key, whereas the user model has ID, name, and email. And so you can see in this diagram that if the user ID is 1, that corresponds to a user with ID 1. If the user ID is 2, that corresponds to a user with primary key 2. So what we would like is to be able to implement this sort of association in code so that we can manipulate the micropost belonging to a particular user, and we can access all of the microposts that correspond to a particular user. So let's take a look at how that works. So notice I said we wanted to talk about the microposts that belong to a given user. Well, the way to say this in code inside the micropost model is that a micropost belongs to user. And in the user model, we want to say that a user has many microposts. Notice that many can be 0 or 1 as well as 2 or more. So in this case, the first user would have 2 microposts, the second user would have 1, but we're still thinking of it as a list of microposts. It could be a list of 1 micropost, a list of 0 microposts. So let's go back here and take a look at the user column. So Rails actually turns user underscore ID into user. It's one of the things you get by using that convention. And so by setting up that association, we would like somehow to see how this user is related to this micropost. So the user with ID 1, how is it related to this micropost? Now, in a real web application, you would actually tie it together and then somehow display, say, all the microposts belonging to a given user. But at this stage, it's a little bit too early for that. But what we are going to do is take a look at the data model using one of the most powerful tools in the Rails toolbox, which is called the Rails console. So let's fire that up. Somehow you always fire up the console. I think that's the official compound verb. You fire it up. The Rails console is effectively a command line for interacting with a Rails application. And you can see that it loaded it in development environment, and it loaded, it just tells us the version of Rails. Again, I'm using the release candidate, but your version might differ, and that's fine. We'll start by typing the command that we saw once before. Remember, in the context of the /users URL, which hit the index action, it called the user.all method. So let's take a look at what that does. So user.all, let's remember from this diagram that we called user.all inside the user's controller. It's right here. So we've just called that same command user.all, and what it's done is it's returned this this sort of way of representing a user. So a user is a Ruby object, and at this point you'll just have to take it on faith that somehow Ruby is representing this user. But you can see that it's got the attributes. It's got the ID, it's got the name, it's got the email address. Notice the ID is 2 because we created a user and then destroyed it. The ID doesn't get recycled. The ID just keeps incrementing. It's known as an auto increment key. So we want to just grab out one user, though, to see how the user relates to micropost. So let's assign that user to a variable. User equals capital user. This is the model name, dot first. So this is a way of pulling out just the first user. And you can see that that is indeed the first user. Also notice that there are a couple of extra things. There's a created at and an updated at. This sort of thing is called a magic column. So created at and updated at are magic columns. We'll be talking more about magic columns later in the tutorial. It's also worth noting that these attributes you can get just by typing a dot and then the name. So user.name is foobar, user.email is foo@bar.com. And one of the cool things about the associations that we set up right here is when you say a user has many microposts and a micropost belongs to user, you can say user.microposts. This is what the has many association buys you. User.microposts. And now you see that it returns this micropost. Oh, and now so you see what happened here. I actually associated these microposts with users 1 and 2, but in fact this is user 2. So let's go back and edit them. Let's edit these guys. Let's set these to user 3. And now in the console, let's reset the user. Now at this point, I'm going to pull out the second of the users, which with ID 3. You can do this by doing user.find and then the name or then the ID of the user. So let's pull this out, and I'm going to say I'm going to reassign this variable. If you're used to statically typed languages, this might freak you out a little bit, but I'm just going to reassign user to user.find of 3. And you can see this is indeed Baz Quux. And so here there was only one micropost. This is one micropost, and these square brackets indicate a Ruby array. Here, user.microposts is an array of 2 microposts, micropost number 1 and micropost number 2. So remember, this user .name is Baz Quux, and .email is baz@quux.net. Let's take a look at this first micropost is equal to micropost dot first. Let's pull out the first micropost. And now let's look at the user corresponding to this micropost. This is what the belongs to user buys you. Micropost. Well, let's look at micropost.content. It's lorem ipsum dolor sit amet. And micropost dot user is just user with ID 3. And notice how nice the syntax is. It's consistent. This is just an attribute of the micropost. It's this static string. This user, it makes user look like a normal attribute of the micropost, but in fact it's a result of joining these two tables together and finding the correspondence between microposts and users. You can also chain things in Ruby. You can do micropost.user.name. See if you can guess what this is. There we go. Of course, this the same name. You can also check, just to double check. You can say micropost.user. This user should equal this user variable, this one that we defined up here, right? So I'm going to say, is this really double equals to user? This is the comparison operator, and indeed, the micropost.user is equal to the user. This concludes our whirlwind tour of a Ruby on Rails application, sort of a 30,000-foot view of a Rails app. We're going to end now with a discussion of some concepts from object-oriented programming. You should feel free to skip this part, but several readers have requested this treatment, and I think it's helpful to see how everything fits together. So let's take a look first at the model inheritance hierarchy for the models. So we saw before that both the user model and the micropost model inherit from active record base. So here's a model inheritance diagram that shows that relationship. Active record base is the base class, and both user and micropost inherit from that class, which means that they get a whole bunch of methods that are defined in active record base, including the all method that we saw earlier in this lesson. Active record base also does some really fancy things. It automatically can detect the names of the columns in the database and create attributes based on those columns. So active record base is where a lot of the magic happens in Rails, and by inheriting from active record base, user and micropost both get those sets of magical things. Let's take a look at the other inheritance that we saw in this lesson. Let's look at the controller inheritance. Compare these two. We can see that there's an extra layer. Let's compare this with the file. I'm going to open up the user's controller. Actually, let's open up the application controller. I'm going to need that in a second. User's controller and the micropost controller. So we see here that the user's controller and the micropost controller both inherit from application controller, which in turn inherits from action controller base, and this is defined by Rails. Action controller base contains a lot of functionality for things like redirecting to URLs and knowing what the request URL is. If you hit the page, it knows where you're coming from, and so on. So there's a lot of functionality built in action controller base, just as there is an active record base. You may wonder why there's an extra layer here. I think the main reason for this design choice is because it's a common thing to want to add something to all of the controllers in an application. And by having users controller and micropost controller both inherit from this intermediate controller, we can actually edit this application controller and then give that functionality to all the other controllers in the application. So let's take a look at application controller. As we see, here's the inheritance from application controller, same thing. And this is application controller, which inherits from action controller base. And there's even something here by default. There's this protect from forgery line. I'm not sure exactly what this does or how it does it, but it sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? Protect from forgery. That's certainly something we'd like to be protected from. And because both of the other controllers inherit from this controller, everything in the application, in this case the user's controller and the micropost controller, are protected from forgery. So since our application is done, let's go ahead and commit the changes. Let's look at git status. Now there are actually three separate kinds of changes. We added a validation to the micropost model. We added the association between micropost and users, and then we deleted a few lines from the micropost controller. Ordinarily, I would try to untangle those and commit them as separate commits. But since this is just a demo app, and since this really isn't a course on Git, I'm just going to wrap these all up in one commit. So git commit -am finished the demo app. And finally, let's push this up to GitHub. I said finally there, but there's actually one more thing I want to do. I want to deploy this to Heroku. Remember how to do that. We do Heroku create, and this will create a new application. Shut this down. All right, so it's created the new application for us. Let's go take a look at it. All right, this is the same default application that we saw before with the first app. So of course we need to push it up. So let's do git push Heroku master. Okay, Heroku is finished deploying our application. Let's go take a look at it. Okay, well, as before with our localhost version, it's just the default Rails application. This is the same as the first app, and we'll see later on in this tutorial, of course, how to get rid of this page. But for now, we're going to keep it. But remember what the URL is for, say, listing all the users. It's /users. So let's go to /users. Now, see if you can guess what's going to happen here. Is it going to list all the users? There aren't any users, right? What is it going to do? We're sorry, but something went wrong. So what could have gone wrong here? Well, what went wrong is that we don't have a data model on Heroku right now. Remember, we have this SQLite database locally. We need to tell Heroku about our data model. So what Heroku does, Heroku actually runs what's called a PostgreSQL database. If you need to do PostgreSQL specific things at some point, you'll probably want to run PostgreSQL locally in production, or in development rather. In fact, you might want to run it in production locally just to double check. But that's beyond the scope of this tutorial, and you can go and Google around for that. We won't actually do anything PostgreSQL specific in this tutorial, so we'll always be using SQLite locally and PostgreSQL in production. And in this case, what we need to do is tell the Heroku production database about our data model. Remember, locally, we did rake db migrate to update the database with our data model, and with Heroku, it's just Heroku rake db migrate. So the rake db migrate just runs through the Heroku gem. And you can see that it created both the users and the microposts on Heroku. So let's go over here and reload it. And there we go. Listing users on Heroku. You can say Michael Hartle, and now I've got a Michael. Oops, I can spell my own name, A-E-L. You'd be surprised how often that's misspelled. At example. Okay, I have a .org example. I wonder what happens if you actually send this email. Look at that. So this is at afternoonice97.heroku.com/users/1. This is on the real live web. This is amazing. That we've gone from having something just locally on our machine to something that's actually on the internet right now. It's very exciting. I shudder to think what this will look like eventually when people. I'm not going to monitor this. People are just going to go nuts. They're going to misspell my name. They're going to do this to bother me, aren't they? So this is great. I mean, it's only the second lesson, and we've already got our second application. Now, this is more than just a single page. This is a real dynamic database-backed web application. It's running in production on Heroku, and this is the kind of thing that 5 years ago or even 3 years ago would have been impossible to achieve this early in our Rails knowledge. So I'm going to destroy this, I'm sure, but I'm sure about destroying the user, and I'm also sure that I'm excited about what we've accomplished.